The Black and Tans left nothing but a trail of destruction and bad memories in Ireland. One could equal them with the curse of Cromwell. They will never be forgotten in Ireland, even though history hasn't shown them for what they were in the country of origin in England. This is the story of the night of the 10th and 11th, the early hours of the morning of the 11th of May 1921, 100 years ago this week. It was a story of the War of Independence, one of the nights of horror or terror that Galway suffered, particularly in St. Bridget's Terrace and O'Donnell's Terrace in Woodquay. Now, what happened on that day, the lead up to this, was that a man by the name of James Folan, he was an IRA activist, was arrested. He was said to have seditious papers on him regarding the earlier murder of IRA volunteer Seamus Quirke by the Black and Tans. That particular episode happened on the night of the 8th of September 1920. When Constable Edward Crum, was shot dead at the railway station in a gunfight with the IRA members. One of the IRA men that lost his life that night as well was Sean Mulvoy. He's buried in St. James's Cemetery in Merview. Now, when James Folan was arrested, he was imprisoned in Galway jail, and he was released on the 10th. This is the irony of it, and the family could well be right on this one. He was released on the 10th of May 1921, not having served his full time, the full sentence. But on the way out that particular evening, that particular morning, the 10th of May, one of the prison wardens actually warned him not to go home. He said, "Folan, don't go home," he said. "It's not safe, it won't be safe tonight." So James Folan made his way to a safe house, which, the irony of this was just a few houses from his own home, and a woman by the name of Ma O'Connell, and she put him up for that night. That afternoon in St. Bridget's Terrace, the children were playing, as was normal, and a group of them were playing skipping. And one of the young girls there, her name was Kitty Traynor. And Kitty told the story, she remembered this all her life, that Hubert Tully, a young man that was staying in Carew's house with Thomas and Elizabeth Carew in number 35 St. Bridget's Terrace. He was a foreman in the Galway railway station, and he was coming home from work. And he normally, sometimes he would join in with the children skipping. He was a very friendly young man. He was 26 years of age, and that evening was no different. He joined with the children skipping, and they had a bit of fun with him. And then he went in for his evening meal. As I said, he was staying in Carew's. Now, one thing that Kitty Traynor noticed, and the other children noticed, was that he was being watched, they felt, because at the time there was a number of Black and Tans standing at the top of the street in St. Bridget's Terrace, watching the terrace. And they felt, it wasn't until afterwards, they felt that they must have been watching Hubert Tully. Now, Tully was from County Roscommon. He had been in Galway for a couple of years, and prior to staying with Carew's in St. Bridget's Terrace, he was actually staying at the home of Broderick's in Prospect Hill. And this possibly set in motion the fact that he was signalled out to be shot. He was a close friend of Sean Broderick, who was a senior commander with the IRA in Galway, and Broderick had been involved also on the night of the 8th of September when the shootout at Galway railway station. In fact, he was shot and wounded that night. The attempt was to kill him by the Black and Tans, but he actually survived it. And Hubert Tully was staying in Broderick's house, and that night the house was burnt while Tully was there. And Tully then later found accommodation with Thomas Carew and Elizabeth Carew in St. Bridget's Terrace, and that's how he actually ended up in St. Bridget's Terrace. It was through that episode. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, this was going into the 11th of May, the Black and Tans left Eglinton Street Barracks. It was the RAC barracks, but the Black and Tans were actually using it as their depot, and the auxiliaries at the time were in Linnenby Castle, and they arrived in O'Donoghue's Terrace approximately 5-10 minutes later, and they banged on the door of Folan's home. Now, as I said, Folan had gone home that night, but his family were in the home house, and his brother Paddy opened the door to them a number of moments later, and they pushed by him. They pushed by Paddy, and they asked where James was, and he said he didn't know. So they searched the house, they searched the backyard, came back in, and went into the bedroom of Christopher Folan, James's younger brother, who was 18 at the time, and Joseph, who was sleeping in the same room, Joseph Folan. And they questioned Christopher first and asked him where his brother was. And Christopher, whether he knew or not, he certainly didn't tell them. And they opened fire, and they shot him and mortally wounded him. They left the room, and they searched the house again. And a few minutes later, for some unknown reason, they went back into the room again. And this time, they questioned Joseph. At this time, Joseph was actually cradling his brother's body in his arms, who was already dead. And by the light of a lantern, they asked him the same questions. And when he either refused to answer again, as I said, the same as his brother, would not divulge the information, they shot him 5 times, and then they left. And then they made their way around the corner, which is close to Hidden Valley, and up into St. Bridget's Terrace. That was their next port of call. Now, after they left, John Folan and Paddy Folan carried Joseph, who was still alive, over the old Sally wall at the back of their house. Now, the Sally wall was a nickname for this particular wall. It was the rear entrance to the county infirmary, which was a hospital on Prospect Hill, because they dare not go by road. So the doctors managed to remove four of the bullets. One of them they couldn't. It was too close to a vital organ. And Joseph lived until the 1940s or 50s with that bullet in his body. So the next part of the story of that night, the night of the 10th and the 11th of May, takes place in St. Bridget's Terrace. They arrived in the terrace, the Black and Tans, and by the way, they were dressed in trench coats, they wore goggles, and they had their faces blackened. But as the fellow said, the dogs in the streets knew they were the Black and Tans. So they went to number 35, which was Carew's, and they banged at the door. And when Thomas Carew answered the door, they asked who Hubert Tully was, and they brushed by him. And Mrs. Carew at this stage had come down the stairs and confronted them, and they pushed her out of the way and made their way up the stairs, went into Hubert Tully's room, pulled him out, dragged him down the stairs in his nightclothes. Now, there is another source that says that Tully heard them entering the house, and rather than get Mr. Carew or Mrs. Carew into trouble, he came down the stairs voluntarily. But one way or another, the outcome was the same for Hubert Tully. He was questioned just very briefly. So they asked him was he Hubert Tully, and when he answered yes, they immediately shot him a number of times. He fell to the ground, almost at the bottom of the stairs, and then they pulled him up against the banister of the stairs. And Mrs. Carew pleaded for his life because he was still alive, he was still breathing, and they turned and they shot him through the head. Tully died immediately. There's a plaque outside that door now in St. Bridget's Terrace, and also on the banister where that shot took place, the bullet is still lodged. It went through Tully, his body, and lodged in the banister of the stairs, the bullet that killed him, and there's a gold cross now that covers that. So they weren't finished in St. Bridget's Terrace. They left the street to go looking for a man by the name of James Traynor. Now, luckily enough, that particular afternoon, Kitty Traynor, who had been playing with Hubert Tully, went down and told her mother and father, told her parents, that the Black and Tans were in the terrace. So Mrs. Traynor and Mr. Traynor, of course, became very, very, very nervous, because James Traynor, their son, who was an older brother than Kitty, was already a marked man. He was a member of the IRA. Now, the interesting thing for this is, for this part of the story, is that across the road from the Traynor's home lived a man by the name of Jack Kelly, and he was an RAC man. And Kelly had called to the door that evening, and he asked Mrs. Traynor about where was James, her son. And she told him that she was afraid to answer at first, because obviously he was an RSE man. But knowing the man very well, and he was friendly with the family, and he was a neighbour, she decided to call out her son. So Kelly told Traynor, he said, James, do not be at home tonight, he said. He said, the Black and Tans, he said, are planning raids tonight of known suspected IRA activists. And he said, you will be shot. Now, he said, I don't know if you have a safe place to go, he said, but certainly, he said, my attic will be the safest place in Galway for you tonight, because they will not search my house, he said. So Traynor had to think for a few minutes, and this was a kind of frightening for him, because he had to place his trust and his life in the hands of this man, who was, one could say, was part of the enemy. And so, but knowing Jack Kelly from his youth, he decided to trust him. So he did, and he hid in the attic that night. Now, after the Tans had finished and killed Hubert Tully and Christopher Folan, they began shouting Traynor's name around the street of St. Bridget's Terrace, hoping to flush him out. And he of course, he was in Kelly's attic and didn't move. And they began firing a number of shots. And of course, they caused absolute terror in the street. Now, when they failed to find him, they then went to Kelly's. This is the amazing thing about it. They went to Jack Kelly's house. They knocked at the door. And when Kelly answered the door, he had no choice. He knew who they were. They went in and they said, Kelly, have you got a drink? So he put down a bottle of whiskey and they had a drink. And unknown to them, James Traynor was hiding in the attic. And they didn't know that Traynor was up there, obviously. And he had to remain silent for over an hour, while the Tans were having their drinks down with Jack Kelly. After they finished, they went about their business to Bohermore. They raided one more house in Bohermore, but they didn't get the IRA man that was there, because the warnings were already gone out. The shots had actually triggered people to people that were on the run to make a move fast. So the Tans went back to their barracks in Elgington Street, leaving the trail of terror behind them. Now, there was another man living in St. Bridget's Terrace, and he died in I interviewed him in 1905. His name was Paddy O'Neill, and he lived in Shantala. But he lived in number 27, St. Bridget's Terrace, and he was a friend of Christopher Folan, but he was also knew Hubert Tully fairly well, and he was a very knowledgeable man. In 1905, I interviewed Paddy O'Neill, and I just asked him, it had nothing to do with the Black and Tan, the interview. It was to do with some other project I was working on. And I just said to him, Paddy, do you remember the Black and Tans? I heard you do. And his fist clenched the chair, and he said they were nothing but pure scum. And then he started to tell me a story, and then he told me the story of the night that Hubert Tully was killed. And he finished by what to me was so sad, that he remembered it so clearly. He said, I heard the first shots, he said, that sent my friend Christy Folan to the grave. 1920 and 1921 is very close to home, because it's within our grandparents' time. And we must remember with great dignity and respect that the men and women that suffered throughout that. Because remember, without the women, the men were lost. Because they hid them, they fed them, and they earned them in some cases. And the women took an active role in the fight for Irish independence as well. And we must remember them all. And in particular now, at this particular time, this moment in our history, 100 years later, we must remember poor Christopher Folan, an innocent young boy of 18 years of age, to be shot dead by these legalised terrorists, and that's what they were. And his brother, the attempt to kill his brother, shows that they had no problem in killing innocent people. And the likes of Hubert Tully, we should all remember them, and with great respect. And James Traynor, just to wrap it up, James Traynor survived the War of Independence. He went through the Republican side during the Civil War, but died tragically in a sense as well. He died in his home bed in 16 St. Bridget's Terrace, and his sister Kitty nursed him. And the Sunday morning that he died, he was only in his 20s. He died as a result of sleeping in cemeteries and sleeping rough around the place with very little food and sleeping in all weathers. And it did affect him. He had pleurisy. Like Baby Duggan, another great IRA activist from Castlegar, who died in St. Bride's home at 26 years of age. James Traynor suffered the same fate. And the morning that he died, his sister told me this in 1975, that she said she nursed him on that Sunday morning while the rest of them were gone to Mass. And he said, Kitty, please take the guns out from under the bed. He thought he was still going through the Black and Tan war. He said, they're coming across the roofs, he said, and they will kill everybody in the house if you don't take the guns out. And Kitty pretended that she was removing the guns from under his bed. He died a few hours later. So I think it's, you know, we shouldn't forget, and we should remember with respect and honour, and I suppose with forgiveness and not with hatred, you know, what happened. But to remember these brave men and women who were willing to give their lives to see that we have the freedom today to speak to as we can. Thank you.